Quilting certainly isn't a quick hobby to have. Finishing a quilt from start to finish can certainly take a lot of time. But today I'm going to share with you 5 tips that have really helped me speed up some of the more tedious parts to quilting. First tip I want to share with you is cutting fabric. When I first started quilting, I would cut one square, one piece at a time, and that can be pretty tedious. But eventually I learned how to cut strips from fabric and then subcut them down. So I'm going to show you how I do that. So I have some beautiful yardage here, and I'm going to cut this into 5-inch squares. Now, I have my fabric folded in half, selvage to selvage, and I have the fold down here where I can see it lined up on a line to make sure I'm straight. Now I could cut strips here with just this one fold, but if I bring the start of the fabric on the other end over to meet it up, I can cut even more squares at one time. So depending on the pattern that you're using and how many squares you need, you can really cut a lot of fabric at once if you have a nice sharp blade in your rotary cutter, and of course if you feel comfortable cutting through multiple layers of fabric. So I'm gonna do this extra layer here. You want to smooth everything out, make sure everything is lined up straight. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to square up one side. Since I have so many multiple layers, I'm going to just do a generous cut to square this up. All right, so I have a nice straight line to work from now. Now this Slidelock here that I'm using works great for cutting through these multiple layers of fabric or these long cuts, because when I press down, these grips come through the bottom and hold the fabric, and I don't have to travel my hand up a ruler. Now what you do probably notice is there's not lines on this, so I'd either need to use the lines on my mat, which may not be as accurate, but I can also use this with another ruler that does have markings. So if I'm cutting 5 inches, I'm going to line up the 5-inch line with that freshly cut edge of fabric. And then I can also down here line up with the fold to make sure I'm squared up nice and straight. So I'll just slide my Slidelock up against it. I can press down, move the ruler out of the way, and then I can cut my 5-inch cut. Now, I can do this multiple times depending on how many squares of fabric I need for the pattern. So I can line up there and get another cut. All right, and so do the same thing. All right, and so I'm just going to cut those so that I can show you what I would do next. All right, so if I have the space, I don't like to move the fabric around too much since it's layered together nicely. I can just turn the mat if I have the space. Here, I don't have the space to, so I'm going to need to turn the fabric. So I'm going to line it up on some lines. So get that one lined up nice and straight. And then I like to try to cut as many of these strips as possible at once. So I'm going to square up one side again. And then now I'll just cut my 5-inch square. So here I'm subcutting these down into the 5-inch squares. And so see, you'll see how fast you can do that, because each cut I make, I'm going to get 4 squares from each of these strips. So I already have 8 of those squares. So you can see just how much faster this can go when you're cutting your strips and then subcutting them down. It makes quick work of cutting for your pattern. My next tip is to use diagonal seam tape. This is probably one of the best and most used tools that I have ever purchased when it comes to quilting. It saves me so much time. Now, I use this diagonal seam tape mainly when I am making half square triangles, but there's a lot of other uses for this handy tape. So first, let me show you how you use it on your machine. So what I like to do is first line it up so that this red line in the center is lined up with my needle. So I'll get the tape up there right at the needle, and you aren't gonna leave it all the way up at the needle because you don't want it to cover your feed dogs, but I'll get it lined up there. And then I just bring it out to the edge of the machine. And you'll want to make sure it is lined up straight. So mine doesn't look like it's lined up straight, so I'm gonna redo that until it is nice and straight. All right, and once I feel like I have it straight along here, I'm gonna cut off just before the feed dogs. All right, so how this really saves me time is with half square triangles. Half square triangles, I usually make them 2 at a time. There's a lot of different ways to make them, but I prefer the 2 at a time method. Now, often when you're making half square triangles, you're going to have 2 different fabrics. I usually, when I'm making them, there's often a darker fabric and a lighter fabric. And on the back of the lighter fabric, you'll usually draw a line from diagonal to diagonal, and you'll use that to sew a 1/4 inch seam along either side of the diagonal. Well, if you're making hundreds of half square triangles, you're going to have to draw hundreds of those diagonal lines. So this seam tape is going to save you from having to draw all of those lines, which to me is amazing. So for the 2 at a time half square triangles, I would lay these right sides together, and I'm able to skip drawing that diagonal line because I have the diagonal seam tape. So I'm laying these right sides together, and then what I'll do is line up the side of my presser foot right along that diagonal point. And then on the other end down here, the diagonal completely opposite of it, it's going to be lined up on that black line here. So the black line here, not with the red line. And then I'm going to sew. Now, the trick to this is that a lot of times when I'm sewing, I want to watch the needle. But with this here, you're going to kind of want to mostly watch that point down here and make sure it stays lined up with the black line. So that was the hardest part to get used to for me, is making sure that the point stays lined up with that black line. So we sew across there, and we have that line sewn without having to draw that line on all of those half square triangles, which is so nice. So for 2 at a time, we're going to do the same thing on the other side. So the side of my presser foot is lined up with the point of the square. Now, I can do it that way because I know I have a scant 1/4 inch presser foot on. If you don't have a 1/4 inch or scant 1/4 inch presser foot, this may not work for you, so keep that in mind. And then again, the opposite point is lined up with that black line. So that is it. I skipped all of that hassle of having to mark that diagonal line just from this lovely seam tape here. It's amazing. So you just saw me get this 1 2 at a time half square triangle prepped, right? But the way I would normally sew something like this is in production style. What I mean is if I'm making half square triangles like this and I have to make a lot of them, I'll chain piece sewing just one side of that half square triangle. So see here, I'll sew these 2 together, and I'll just sew one side of it, right? And I'll keep the thread there. It's called chain piecing. And then, I'll sew another one. And typically when I'm sewing this way, I'll sew all of them that I have on that one side. I feel like working in this sort of production style makes me move a lot quicker, more efficiently, and I feel like I'm less likely to make mistakes than if I'm doing one at a time. So I have that one side sewn, and then I would move on and do the other side. So I don't just work this way with the sewing portion. I also work this way with cutting and pressing and trimming as well. So after getting both sides of my half square triangles sewn, I always like to press them. So when I get all of my 2 at a time half square triangles ready, I press them all. So then I'll move on to cutting them all in half, right along the diagonal. So I get this step done all at once. I'll just sit and cut all of them in half. Even if I have hundreds of them, I will cut them all in half. And I feel like when I do it this way, I can just be much faster about it. I kind of get in a groove and I get it done just that much quicker. So then after that, I can move on to pressing them all again. And and now that they're all pressed, I can trim them down, which that's something I want to talk about too. So with a lot of blocks in quilting, you'll find yourself needing to trim them down. And when I get to trimming, I work production style with that too. I will trim them all at one time. And that can be so tedious as well. So I really recommend finding a good trimmer for trimming things like half square triangles, quarter square triangles, flying geese. Now, I really like to use the Trimlock. Of course, I'm biased to that, but I think it works really, really quickly. So here is a Trimlock for trimming 3.5-inch half square triangles or quarter square triangles. And then here is a Trimlock for trimming down flying geese that are 3.5-inch by 2-inch. So I'll show you how to use both of these. Now, even if these aren't the ones you want to go with, find a trim tool that works really well for you and how you like to work. Huge, huge tip. It was a game changer for me when I found ones that I like to use. I can move so much faster. So here is the half square triangle, and then the trim lock, all you'll do is line up one of the diagonal lines with the seam you have. And then since these are cut to size, all you have to do is turn. You don't have to re-measure and line things up again. You can just cut all sides by turning the trim lock. It has grips on it to hold in place on the fabric. Or if you prefer, you could also use a mat that is a turntable, but you can make really quick work of making sure your half square triangles are trimmed down to size if you have a good trimmer, whether it's this one or another one. So the flying geese trim lock works in the same way. You'll line up the diagonal lines with your block, with the seams on your block, and then you'll just trim around it. So quick work of trimming, and they're available in a lot of different sizes. Now let's move on to the last tip I have for you in streamlining some of the tedious steps in quilting, and that comes to binding. I think binding for me is pretty tedious, especially folding the binding in half and pressing it. I just feel like it takes so much time, and I inevitably always burn myself too somehow. So I found this tool looking around on Amazon, and I absolutely love it. So it is called the third hand binding tool, and it comes in so handy for me. Whenever I make binding that is a 2.5-inch strip, I always use this. Now, this binding tool that I purchased is for 2.5-inch strip bindings. They have multiple sizes on there just in case you like to make binding a different size than I do. The first thing you'll do is need to feed your binding strip through the opening here. And I honestly think that's the hardest part. So what you'll do is fold your binding in half to start feeding it through the opening. So you'll just start feeding it through there, and I always have to grab a pin to get it all the way through. So once I start seeing it kind of peek through here, I'll grab a pin and start pulling it through. I'll just grab onto the fabric and pull it through. So you see it doesn't take too long once you kind of learn the little trick to it. All right, so you see you have it through. And then usually I do this on my larger pressing area, but to be able to film it and show you here, I'm kind of working in a smaller area, but it'll still work. I can show you what we do. So usually I would clamp this on to the end of my table where I'm pressing, but I'm going to put it on the edge of my mat here just because that's what I'm able to attach it to right now to show you how to do this. And I'm just going to let it kind of hang off the end of my table. But you'll see here, you kind of have a decent amount of space to move it down, and depending on how wide your table is. So keep that in mind. And then all you'll do is start pressing it. So I'll press it, and then you just literally pull it through and keep pressing it. So I don't even lift up the iron too high, just enough to not warp the fabric as I pull it through. And then I will lay the iron down a little heavier on it. So I kind of lift the iron up a little bit and feed it through, and then I will press it really well. So do you see how quick this is to get your binding folded and prepped? And then I don't even have to worry about burning my hands. It's not even, the iron's not even close to my hands because I'm not having to fold it over. The tool is folding it for me. Now, when it gets to a seam, I press my seams open, but it can still be a little tricky to get them through there. So I just kind of hold both sides and tug it through, and then I can just move forward with pressing it. So that's honestly the hardest part when you get there, is getting those seams through. But other than that, it's such a breeze working with binding now. It doesn't even upset me anymore when I have to make a new binding. And honestly, when I first got this tool, I was like, what quilts can I make binding for? Because it was actually a little more fun now. It wasn't as daunting of a task to have to think about burning my fingers and sitting there folding all this long binding strip over and pressing it. It's just such a breeze. So I will link to the tools that I used today down in the description of this video. Hopefully you found some of these tips helpful. And if you have any tips that you would like to share with me and other viewers in the comments, please let us know. I'm always looking for fun and easy tips for working on different steps in quilting that can become pretty tedious. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.